Thank you. Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the member for Wirral South. I am going to speak on perhaps the narrow but extremely important topic of the customs union, and specifically against amendments J in the name of my right honourable friend the member Rushcliffe and K in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. And this is against what I believe to be the seriously defective proposal of a customs union with the European Union whilst not having a seat at the table. Now, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've given this question a great deal of consideration over the last almost 3 years, particularly my 2 years spent at the Department for International Trade in charge of trade policy. And a customs union has its superficial temptations. It obviously keeps trade close, although worth pointing out not necessarily frictionless. You need the single market as well for that. It avoids having to agree to free movement, and it may not need financial contributions, and clearly is likely to provide short-term relief for industrial supply chains. But, Mr. Speaker, it would be a historic mistake to do this. Customs unions have been successful in history, but essentially for countries going in the opposite direction, for countries coming together into a political union. If you look at the history of the Zollverein in Germany in the 19th century, that was all part of the process of German unification. If you look at the partial customs union in the name of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1947 or 49, I forget which was a partial customs union as a precursor to the EEC and the Treaty of Rome. But, Mr. Speaker, we are heading in the opposite direction. This is the wrong compromise, and a customs union would give short-term relief at the cost of long-term pain and a democratic deficit which would grow and grow over the years. I've written articles about this, notably today, Mr. Speaker, in Times Red Box. But our trade policy, Mr. Speaker, would end up being set by others, and that is the historic mistake. I'm going to give 4 or 5 very quick examples of where it has a really serious impact on this country. For example, on tariff policy. Tariff policy would be set by the European Union to protect their products from others coming in, and would not be set in the interests of the UK, which would likely to be different. For example, the current trade dispute between the United States and the European Union, there are punitive tariffs on bourbon coming into this country. Let us say there is a future trade dispute between the EU and the US involving Scotch whisky. Obviously isn't produced in the European Union, and there will be no incentive for the European Union in that customs union to seek to defend Scotch whisky. The second area will be on trade agreements. We've talked before about the Turkey trap, that essentially when the EU enters into a trade agreement with a third country, that if the UK were in a customs union, we would have to offer access to our markets, but we would not get the reciprocal access to that country in return. That is going to be a massive democratic deficit. Secondly, this is what amazes me, Mr. Speaker, that is the official Labour policy to do this. I remember well the disputes around TTIP. The biggest objections to TTIP came actually from the Labour side. Right. And now we have a situation where trade policy will be determined by others without even a UK seat at the table. Now, if they thought at the time that TTIP would lead to US private healthcare companies gaining access to the NHS, and we had a seat at the table, what will it be like when we don't have a seat at the table? But that is the official Labour policy. On trade remedies, Mr. Speaker, I'm amazed that the member for Stoke had his name on one of these amendments. Absolutely incredible. Trade remedies would now be conducted by the European Union, not by this country. They are currently conducted by the European Union. We have a seat at Trade Council. I was that seat for a long time. And the UK participates in trade remedies to defend our products. There is no guarantee. In fact, it's highly unlikely the EU would do the same, particularly if it's a product not produced in the EU. When it comes to doing a WTO-compliant study of the product, you can guarantee, Mr. Speaker, that the studies which would take priority would be to defend the interests of EU members, not to defend the interests of non-members of the European Union. So I find it amazing, Mr. Speaker. And finally, on trade preferences for access to the developing world, I find it staggering that the Labour Party is proposing ceding control over trade preferences to Brussels without the UK having a seat at the table. That would be unacceptable to my constituents and I believe theirs as well.